Well, it's probably getting time for you to deliver your first full speech. Have you thought about what you're going to take with you to the podium to help you remember your speech? Well, you may be thinking you're going to take your formal outline with you. If you do, I got some news for you. That's probably not going to be allowed. Instead, you're going to need to take your speaking notes with you. Something like this. Now you might ask, what in the world are speaking notes? Speaking notes are an abbreviated version of your formal outline that are on note cards that you take with you to the podium. Now, you might be wondering, well, why can't I just take my outline, my formal outline with me? Well, the primary reason that you're not encouraged to do that is there's a tendency when we have the full outline in front of us to want to rely on it, and we end up sort of reading our outline rather than delivering our speech. Like a professor once said to me, he said, "Jess, a speech is not an essay on its hind legs." Now what he meant is that a speech should not just be an essay read aloud. And if we take our outlines with us, there's a tendency to kind of read the outlines and it ends up sounding like an essay. Instead, a speech should sound more spontaneous and natural. And so to prevent that tendency to read, we use speaking notes. Now, when you're putting together your speaking notes, what you're going to do is put together a very abbreviated version of your formal outline on a few note cards. Instead of using complete sentences, you're going to use a few keywords or a phrase. So instead of having a formal outline that looks like this, you're going to use speaking notes that are abbreviated and that look like this. Now, there's an occasion where you may be allowed to write something out completely, and that's when you have a quotation. You may be allowed to bring a quotation note card with you. If your quotation's more than a sentence or two, your professor will probably allow you to write it out completely and take it with you. Now, you may wonder, why in this one case do I get to write it out? Well, when you're quoting someone, you need to be exact. You don't want to make any mistakes, so you're allowed to write it out so that you can refer to it if you need it. However, even though it's written out completely, you don't want to read the quote. You want to know it so well that you can look at the audience periodically as you're saying the quote, but you still have it there for reference if you need it. Why don't you take a look at these student speaking notes? Do you think they were effective? Unfortunately not. Most of the student speeches suffered because they didn't follow these important guidelines for developing speaking notes.
Each of you, well, most of you, will probably relate to what I'm going to say. Sorry, one second. Oh, okay. Each of you will probably relate to what I'm going to say today because most of the sources that I used and resources I used came from this campus.
One of the first guidelines for developing speaking notes has to do with the size of the note cards. Typically, you want your note cards to be about this size, which is 4 by 6 inches. 3 by 5 inches tends to be a little bit small and hard to read, and 5 by 7 tends to be a little large. Also, you probably want your note cards to either be white or some light pastel color. If you use bright colors, or especially if you use a variety of bright colors, it's extremely distracting for the audience. And you want your note cards not to be the focus of attention, so use a pale pastel or white. I also typically recommend that you only use a few note cards, maybe 1 or 2, though you may go up to as many as 5 or 6. I recommend 1 or 2 because it makes sure that then you don't just try to cram your formal outline onto your speaking note cards. And if you have a lot of speaking note cards, there's a real temptation just to cram it on there and then you end up reading it after all. There's another reason I recommend only a few note cards. If you have a lot of note cards, it's really easy to get lost. If there's just 1 or 2, you can't get lost. If you have a lot and you start getting nervous, you might end up getting your note cards out of order, and that's going to make you look disorganized and more nervous than you probably are. In addition, when you do your note cards, you want to use large font, or you want to write quite large so that you can look down easily. You want it to be very legible so you can glance down at your note cards for just a second, see the key idea, and then speak to the audience directly. You also want to use very short phrases, just a word or two. You don't want to write out a sentence. It's just, remember, a word or two to trigger your memory, not to tell you exactly what you're supposed to say. Recognize that your speaking notes are really just a visual framework to remind you of what your outline is and what your speech is. It's just a little hint. It's not the whole thing. Now, occasionally you might be using some sort of electronic presentation program, like PowerPoint. And if you do, they have a notes page option that you may find really helpful for composing your speaking notes. Now realize that when you get up to the podium to give your speech, your speaking notes are going to be your best friend. You're going to want to make sure that they're in very good shape so you can give a good speech. You want to write large, you want to be legible, use just a few key words, and you also want to make sure you practice with your note cards. I've seen students practice only with their outlines until they get up in front of the class, and then they're not used to the note cards and it unnerves them. So make sure you practice with your note cards so that you're used to using the note cards and handling them, and you're used to just working off a few key phrases. Otherwise, your speech probably won't be as good as it can be.